Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is a nasal spray for migraines that's just been approved by the FDA. Various ridiculous treatments being proposed, whether that is using Ivermectin for COVID-19 or autism. Gwyneth Paltrow continues to show that she has no idea about what health involves and is giving out some very bad vibes. That keto diet could actually be bad for you with regards to cardiovascular disease and health. The world's largest organism is slowly being consumed and, well, that's rather disconcerting when you realize we're not talking about a whale. When the world shut down, for lack of a better phrase, due to COVID-19, animals within zoos started behaving differently. Those of you who either enjoy mathematics, numbers, or terrible puns may have celebrated Pi Day this week. AI is increasingly engaging in disconcerting behaviors, especially after it ended an exhibition by wiping out the humanity in its model. America continues to refuse to use any civilized number system, even when describing an asteroid that will pass by Earth this week, and a solar eruption on the far side of the sun was so powerful that the shockwave hit Earth. Let's start with the simplest news, which is saying a lot. FDA approving the first ever nasal spray for migraines that's fast acting. The simplest explanation is that the drug acts just like nasal sprays for allergies. Shove it up your nose, squeeze, and deposit the medication. It's from Pfizer, and the idea is, by delivering it so quickly, via the nasal cavity, you get relief much sooner. It's one of the same reasons why things like cocaine are snorted. Fast access to the brain and absorption through the brain's membrane, and therefore relief of pain, or a high for cocaine. The study that has been the foundation for its approval found that relief was available in under 15 minutes. And that's pretty damn quick, all things considered. Admittedly, given the recent history of the FDA approving things based on recent trials, there may be some more questions in the near future. But for now, the approval has happened and not a lot else can be done. Moving on to news about drugs that are being used improperly now, and specifically, Danny Lemoy and the fact that he was taking Ivermectin daily in an attempt to ward off various symptoms, particularly of COVID, has now died. Yes, he died despite taking what was being purportedly described as a treatment to prevent COVID-19 from killing people. As has clearly been established by anybody looking at this from the clinical research, Ivermectin does not treat COVID-19. It never has, and it never will. This is why it was stupid that he was taking veterinary Ivermectin intended for horses and cows. He is neither of these creatures, and he doesn't have worms. Therefore, he did not need it, and it is no wonder that given he is taking improper medication for improper conditions, that he died. This has led to a surprising moment of realization for people who were following him as a sort of influencer. They're now questioning whether or not the side effects they're experiencing from taking improper medication for no obvious reason, or that the symptoms they are experiencing are actually something they should be taking seriously. And the answer to both of these is yes. You should be questioning anyone online telling you that they have the cure or treatment for something that is not clinically substantiated. This is even more significantly compounded by the fact that he had been diagnosed with a heart condition, specifically a form of hypertrophy in which his heart had grown twice the size that it should have been. The fact that he's now taking medication that places greater strain on his body, this is compounded even further by the simple fact that he was taking Ivermectin while also being diagnosed with heart hypertrophy. That is, his heart was twice the size it should have been. And yet he was still taking a medication that created all kinds of side effects, and apparently was claiming that ivermectin had regenerated his heart. The issue was never it was going to regenerate it, it was it going to stop it from growing, occluding the ventricles in his heart and thereby preventing blood from being pumped around his body, which is the concern with hypertrophy. As we now know, the answer to that is no, it won't, and now he's dead because he did something stupid. While it is incredibly harsh to speak poorly of the dead since they're no longer able to defend their own actions, there are some actions that simply are indefensible. Unfortunately, it does get worse, and not just for the reasons of this guy, but that his actions have implications for individuals who can't make their own choices. Specifically, children. They had developed a regimen of administering ivermectin to children. Sadly, even in death, this bullshit will drag on, as it seems like the Telegram group, which is where much of this was being facilitated through, has continued even after his death and is growing in size. Adding on to the bullshit that was giving ivermectin to children, some of the individuals have expanded its application to just being a dewormer and COVID treatment, and in the end, a failed treatment for heart disease, to a treatment to give to children with autism. Yeah, that is not how this works. To give one example that occurs at the very top of the article that we refer you to in the description box below, I have been applying ivermectin liquid to my granddaughter's feet, belly button, and swabbing her ears for 6 weeks now. She complains of sporadic blurry vision and sometimes headaches. No shit she's complaining of these things. You're giving her medication intended for horses and cows. They're a damn child. Tiny by comparison to these creatures, and no doubt the medication you are giving them, massively overdosing them, given the relative size differences between them, a cow, or a horse. The truly sad part is that this group of nutjobs isn't even part of the previous group we mentioned, where the guy died due to heart conditions. This is an entirely separate group of crazy nutjobs who thinks it's a great idea to what is, in this instance, give their child a poison in an attempt to cure them of what is a genetic condition that causes changes in their brain in early childhood that by now are established and effectively irreversible. So they're going to poison them instead. Instead of at least taking a moment and going, okay, we've given the child this medication for however long it is, and they've not, for lack of a better word, recovered from their autism, but instead started vomiting, changing complexion, experience seizures, become hyperactive, agitated, or have headaches, let's just keep giving them the drug. At some point, you either need to accept what you're doing isn't working, or worse yet, you're actively causing harm because you have no idea what you're doing with ivermectin, what it is, or how it works. It's not going to do anything. When these idiots start saying that bleeding or vomiting or diarrhea are all indicators of the body clearing out toxins, no, that's not what it's doing. That is a sign of damage being caused by stupidity. Clearing out toxins is when you urinate or defecate, because that is how the liver and kidneys remove toxins. You don't need to bleed from unexpected places at improper times for that to happen. It occurs regardless. The fact that rather than provide these kids with the appropriate degree of counseling, psychological support, and possibly medication that is actually intended for this purpose, they instead choose to torture them with worming medication is just unbelievable, and the fact that they're allowed to get away with abusing either children who are actually children, or children in terms of their kids they're responsible for, with the support of these groups is heinous. Sadly, they are not the only ones this week who are so publicly spreading dumb and dangerous ideas. The difference is that, by comparison to the last two examples, Gwyneth Paltrow has a much larger platform with much greater reach. And as a result, the bullshit she spreads is, well, in a way worse. In this instance, the admission that she gets ozone in her rectum. Ozone is not something that is safe to have for any reason. The simple reality is that ozone is 3 oxygen molecules bound together. They are a reactive species. As a result, when you pump ozone into your rectum, or for that matter, any other orifice, or breathe it in, you will cause localized tissue damage. This will then lead to inflammation. That will then cause discomfort. To put it in a very blunt manner, ozone is likely to have the same sort of effects on your body, and especially inserting it into any cavity, as you would any other very reactive chemical. For example, bleach. It will cause damage. It will cause inflammation. It will cause irritation. At high enough levels, it could probably be toxic enough to cause cancer. In the end, it's no wonder that Paltrow has the opportunity to put ozone up her ass, as she spreads so much shit there can't be any left in there. Going from one bad health behavior, or fad, to another, although less clearly established, being as negative. That is ketogenic diets, or keto diets. Keto diets are where you largely forgo any and all carbohydrates and instead rely heavily on lipid or fats and protein to provide the bulk of your necessary nutrition. By themselves, ketogenic diets are not necessarily bad. They can be extremely useful for especially young children that have seizures, reducing the duration and severity of those seizures. But they are an exception, not the rule. As a general rule, ketogenic diets are no better, and in some ways worse, than other, much more balanced and nuanced diets would be. Despite this reality, they are something of a fad that has become more popular over the preceding years. This means that, naturally, there has been more interest in seeing whether or not there are implications above and beyond just the loss of weight. People have at various times claimed benefits to their psychiatric conditions and more, but again, as said, these have been poorly, if at all, substantiated. What we do know, and what research has reinforced this week, is that consuming high-fat, high-protein diets is not good for your cardiovascular health, something that should not be a surprise. We've known for decades now that high-fat diets, or more specifically, diets high in cholesterol, and especially the low-density lipids, are bad for you. They lead to increased atherosclerotic development or plaques in your arteries. The study should, however, be taken with some salt, as you would with any ketogenic meal, in that it is based purely on observational data from the UK Biobank, and it does use data over a 10-year period, but it's self-reported data, which, as we have said before, is something you need to be careful when evaluating. As a general rule, self-reported data is not as reliable. Further to that, the number of participants who fit the ketogenic diet category was relatively low, at about 305. The number of individuals in the study who weren't on the ketogenic diet was about 1,200, so there is a roughly 4-to-1 ratio here. What they found could be very quickly and easily summarized as significantly higher levels of low-density lipoproteins or cholesterol. These are the kind that cause problems, especially atherosclerotic blockages, from those plaques, which can then break off and cause cardiac arrest, stroke, and more. There were also other similar apolipoproteins that were also considered bad cholesterol as a result. This means you are in exactly the same place as doctors, dietitians, and health experts have been advising not to try get into for the last few decades, in that you have high cholesterol, inadequate carbohydrate intake, and you are at greater risk of cardiovascular disease. According to this study, about twice the risk by choosing a ketogenic diet. Going from the ketogenic diet to the Mediterranean diet now, and the relationship between it and Alzheimer's disease. With regards to this study, it's at least considerably more, let's say, robust than the ketogenic study was. Largely, it involves the follow-up with 581 individuals who were, admittedly, all quite elderly when they first entered the project, roughly an age of 84 on average. Most of them died at an average of 91. Each year, they conducted a food frequency questionnaire, and they were also given the requirement, let's say, that they donate their brain to research at death, which is fair enough. It's not a requirement, but it's certainly a, let's say, strength to this study. By being able to both look at the brains of the individuals, know what they consumed throughout the last 7 years of their life on average, and having such a large participant pool, you can draw some pretty strong results from this. Admittedly, again, there are some issues, but for the purposes of this video, we'll gloss over those, with it adequate to know that although this is a very strong study, there are some things that could have been done differently, and some of the conclusions drawn may not be as solid as believed. The gist of it is that the Mediterranean diet can reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. The reality is that there is a lower, let's say, risk factor profile amongst people who follow these diets, and they generally are healthier overall. So it's unclear as to whether or not it's the diet providing the benefit, or those who follow these diets are already protected through whatever other behaviors they're exhibiting, which is especially difficult to evaluate or establish given the nature of this study. Further, as with other studies we've mentioned, there is a lot of self-reported data, and that's a concern. The reality is that, as we've said before, if you rely on self-reported data, you are relying on the individuals involved to be completely forthright, honest, and accurate in their reporting, something that you simply can't rely on humans to be. They do not have perfect recollection of what they have or have not eaten. They don't have a perfect recollection of what it is they have or have not done. They may be trying to be as positive, helpful, and beneficial as possible, even if that doesn't actually help the study because it simply adds in, let's say, randomness that's not really supported. Going from behavior-related news that's all about food to behavior-related news and vaccines. Specifically, sleep and vaccinations. This is an interesting segue, primarily because it relies on a meta-analyses. And meta-analyses are towards the very top of research. They are not the very top, but they are near the peak. And it's because they take the collective knowledge of all other published research, try and analyze it collectively, and figure out whether or not individual studies are outliers, anomalies, or if there's some pattern here that doesn't really make sense. The key to this is that when they were looking at this, they found that the worse your sleep, the worse an antibody response is to something when you're being vaccinated for it. This can be particularly important if you are, let's say, stressed or in a situation in which sleep is not really a viable option a lot of the time. That means those who are either working abnormal hours, shift work, or simply in an environment where sleep is uneasy to come by, they may not get the same protection as somebody who can get a solid 8 hours night over night. Now, while we state the study found that having less sleep meant less antibody response to a vaccine, that is what was found as far as the numbers go. But what is key here is that it did not reach a statistically significant threshold. That means although that is the pattern, it's not what they actually found. The key reason we say this is that statistical significance needs to be included, otherwise you may not be able to state whether or not the observation you are making is something that's actually occurring, or part of an erroneous or background noise that's being picked up unexpectedly. This is where things become a little more complex and controversial. They did not find a statistically significant response in their whole group analyses. So they did what a lot of researchers do and started to do a subgroup analyses to see if a smaller subset of their overall study, or in this case meta-analyses, did have significance. And they found just that. They found that men, but not women, had statistical significance based on sleep. Yeah, this may or may not be a big issue. There are concerns that once you start trying to slice your subgroups to a certain point, you are basically fishing for significance. In this case, splitting between male and female may not be that. In fact, the only real way to establish whether or not what they have found is, let's say, reality, or at least applicable to the real world and not just an artifact of their methodology, is to run a study looking at exactly this: number of hours of sleep and antibody response, something which they're not able to do given the nature of a meta-analysis. That is, take existing research and try and see if there is a pattern within their results. Obviously, that doesn't involve new, novel, or original research that they can compare it against, but it is possible that they now could. As the article linked in the description box goes into detail on, this study raises a lot more questions than it actually answers. Some of the most pressing are going to be, is it the amount of sleep, or is it another variable related to sleep that's creating a confounding effect? For example, the body goes through some very explicit hormonal cycles throughout the day. The circadian rhythm is the one people are most familiar with. Is the change in this rhythm, or this cycle, due to something like insomnia, what causes the change in antibody response, or is it purely sleep itself, and it's simply not well established? All this has done is raise a lot of questions, but interesting questions nonetheless. In other research-related material that is all about raising questions, the origin of COVID-19. There are a number of different competing theories, some more questionable than others, but none have a clear answer. There is a simple reality that we don't know, and we likely will never know, where it came from. We do know that coronaviruses have spread from bats to humans on a regular basis. That things like MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, is also likely to have come from animals to humans. Animals, and especially bats, are a very, very solid reservoir of diseases like this. This is why there are issues around claims that it is a lab leak, that it is originating from the Hunan seafood market, and from there it spread to humans because bats somehow were able to segue between species that were then sold there. All of this is basically the huge controversy because nobody can state definitively one origin or another, nor can they rule out one origin or another. When you also have government agencies adding fuel to the fire, so to say, it's also that much more difficult. The article we link in the description box below from The Atlantic also is adding its own fuel to the fire, and is making a case for the natural origin argument. In this case, it is relying on one particular phenomena. We know that in order for COVID-19 to infect humans, it had to go through an intermediary species, from bats to something to humans. There were a handful of candidate species, and one was the raccoon dogs that were being sold at the market, albeit illegally. They were thought to possibly be the intermediary species that allowed for the infection of humans, and it seems that Chinese researchers may have found genetic evidence showing that it was indeed infecting raccoon dogs that were present in the market. The article puts forward a statement that they believe the swabs were taken in the very earliest days of the COVID outbreak from the raccoon dogs by China's Center for Disease Control and Prevention. that the data from these was very quietly released recently, and that it supports the case that it was the raccoon dogs that were helping to spread it. This is where we enter a problematic area. The information that the Atlantic is referring to was already available, and the researchers who had made it available, very quietly, had claimed that it did not indicate an animal host for COVID-19, or at least none that could be identified. Yet, the Atlantic is now claiming that it does exactly that. The reason why the claim is not necessarily baseless, even if the original researchers aren't in agreement, is the nature of the genetic material that's found in this dataset. The non-Chinese researchers who analyzed it have made the claim that it appeared to contain genetic material which was a match for the raccoon dog, and that's why they believe that may have been the intermediary species. Further to what we've already mentioned, there are issues around the fact that the data was available, and shortly after this sort of information started spreading around, the data was also pooled. There may be issues to do with what's actually in there. In the end, this doesn't really provide any definitive proof either way. All it's really done is slightly tilt the scale to favour an animal origin from a bat to a raccoon dog to then humans. But we still don't have anything definitive, and as such, debate will likely rage on until we find something close to a smoking gun. Shifting from wild animals to the world's largest organism, and it is also wild. It is a giant tree found in the Wasatch Mountains of western USA. And this is a giant 106-acre group of quaking aspen. But what is key here is that every last one of them is a clone. Yeah. The idea is that as the tree has gradually grown, it's either fallen over or its roots have started giving out growth and growing up into their own individual trunks. As these have then grown in turn or fallen over, they've then caused more trees to start growing from the fallen over part or the roots that have spread out. This means that every last trunk is connected via a root network, despite above ground each individual trunk is its own tree, so to say. Underground, they're all connected via roots, and so it's one giant copse of trees. This is not a phenomena that happens very quickly, and it's thought to have taken about 14,000 years for it to have spread as far as it has. However, most of the trunks, so to say, or perhaps it'd be better to call them stems, have only been present for 130 years. And this is why we mention a number of possible different ways that they could have been able to grow as they have. This leads to the interesting way it's being consumed. Because humans tend to be fairly straightforward, we don't like having competition. As such, we tend to get rid of it one way or another. In America, this competition would have been in the form of wolves and cougars. These kept deer and elk in check, thereby preventing them from predating too heavily on the trees. As humans have removed these predators, we've removed the population check on deer and elk, and so, because they have such a massive source of food that is so well established, they've started eating the very young and juvenile trees, thereby preventing it from expanding outwards. But this also means that there's no way for the new growing trees to replace those that are lost. Further to the predatory effect of deer and elk, there are also several diseases that are hitting the older developed trunks of this particular tree, they being sooty bark canker, leaf spot, and conch fungal disease. These are all affecting the oldest growth, and it means that you don't have young new trees growing from the root mass, nor do you have the old trees sustaining it. Shifting from environmental news about plants to animal news and the interesting parallels between the behavior of some monkeys and what humans used to do, that is, when we were much less evolved. Monitoring of macaques has found that they're using broken stones as a way to break open nuts and other solid fruits and foods. This is not a new phenomena. As said, it very much follows a similar find for what the earliest humans would do when we were still in Africa. These are some of the earliest human sites though. This is the key here. The evidence shows that the very earliest humans, and at the moment macaques, were using these stones to break open their food and as a result, breaking rock. When the rocks were broken, they would then become new tools, as the realization set in that you didn't necessarily need to rely on solid food to do this, but instead another larger and most likely much more solid rock. You could shape these tools or create tools as you wanted, instead of relying on pure luck. The phenomena is relatively new, and that may in part explain why, where humans gradually grew to use these as their tools in their own right and make them without relying on luck, macaques purely use them until they break, and they use them solely for getting to the food that they want to get to at that time. In other animal, or more accurately insect news, how do bees learn to dance? And this is one of those things that you may or may not have learnt inadvertently at some point. Bees will dance to indicate what they want. For the most part, this is indicating where and what some sort of food source is, so that other bees can then travel to the same location and get food from it, largely in the form of pollen. The research indicates that the bees learn from older, more mature bees how to dance and therefore how to avoid making mistakes in direction, duration, or nature of what they would find at the end of that trip. Those bees that did not have any mature bees to, for lack of a better word, role model or teach them, made significantly more mistakes. It is, for lack of a better phrase, a kind of social education, the same way that people might learn how to behave in society, through interacting with older and more mature individuals who would guide them in what is and is not appropriate. Shifting from bees to zoo animals, and specifically how during the height of COVID-19 and the lockdowns that were involved in many places, a lot of zoos saw decreased visitors. This meant there were fewer people passing through, both employees and people there to see the animals. This led to a very interesting and practically otherwise impossible to conduct bit of research. That is, how did primates react to the change in people? They studied bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, and baboons. The observation of these animals found that when the zoos were open and people were visiting, that gorillas would spend less time resting. Chimpanzees would also engage more and eat more. Interestingly, the baboons were perhaps the, let's say, most changed. They engaged in less sexual and dominance behavior. They also tended to try and interact with visitors compared to ranger vehicles. On top of these points, it seems that both the gorillas and bonobos spent more time in their groups than they did when there were no visitors at all. Next we go to animal news that is not necessarily wildlife related, but could have implications for reproduction. The idea that you can take two male mice and create a viable offspring from it. Yeah, this may sound insane, but the idea is you can take the genome, specifically the chromosomes of one, and make it an XX chromosome, while also having the other be an XY chromosome. They're then able to, for lack of a better phrase, this allows you to chemically and genetically modify a cell. You both have the chromosomal changes, XY to XX, but also to change it from what would be a sperm or whatever other cell they're going to use into an ovum or oocyte as it's called. This means that 2 male mice could produce a viable offspring. In this case, some of the technology is not necessarily new. We have been able to chemically and biologically regress, let's say, cells that have completely differentiated back to stem cells and then redifferentiate along a completely different line of development. The difficult part here was not so much the stem cell element, as it was removing the Y chromosome and then replicating the X chromosome that remained without any errors and ensuring that whichever of the X chromosomes found its way into the offspring, it was complete and functional. You may be thinking, this is great news. The news, though, is not so great. And unfortunately, you may be bursting a bubble with this, but there is very little chance this will find its way to humans any time in the near future. The very first reason is that the difference between a human and a mouse is not insignificant. Second, that it took 100 fertilized eggs done this way to lead to 1 live mouse pup. That is a tiny amount and means that there is a very little chance that this will come anywhere near ethics approval for human work any time in the near future. There are also some, let's say, questions about the ability to actually bring a child to term, given that both of the parents would be male. They would either have to need to find a surrogate, or there would need to be a, let's say, volunteer willing to carry the child, depending on the circumstances surrounding it. But then again, this also involves a significant prediction about what may happen in 10 or more years in the future. In further news that might be somewhat unsettling, there have been yet further resurrected viruses from the Siberian tundra, or more accurately, the Siberian permafrost. Yet more multi-thousand-year-old viruses have been resurrected from what should have either been death or, in this case, dormancy and hibernation. Yeah, this is not exactly the start you want to hear to any particular news article, as it's very reminiscent of a horror movie. This is more true when you consider some of the statements that the researchers involved have said, and that is that the viruses they are resurrecting, so to say, have been able to infect amoebas that they'll grow alongside. This means that they could be a viable public health emergency if they happen to be able to infect a host and then spread. There is no reason why the increasing number of them being exposed due to climate change amongst other things should be ignored. There is a very good chance that at some point something particularly nasty will be unearthed, will survive, and then will spread. It's not so much a case of if, but when. Having now suitably shattered any and all joy you've had this week, a slight pick-me-up of sorts. That is Pi Day. Nothing particularly exciting, but you may or may not find Pi Day interesting. Now to bring you back to reality. This is a sort of technology piece of news, but also something of an art piece. The art piece, let's call it, is something of a prediction of what would happen in the future, and is a memorial to the demise of humanity. The idea is that it's meant to show what the future would hold if we actually went down the path of AI, and AI eventually takes over for all intents and purposes. It's a much less interesting version of the Terminator. Further to that art is a interesting blog post from Neurologica, which largely looks at the idea of AI being sentient. Over recent months, there's been the interesting argument that ChatGPT, among others, is really increasingly stepping forwards to the point where you could say it is sentient. There's also the claim that Google's Lambda is also sentient, although that is far more controversial. In this case, the article puts forward an interesting proposition. Are we going to rely solely on the output of the system? That is, how it analyzes and processes the information is ignored, and solely on what it says or does? Or are we going to rely on both the process of analyzing information and what it says as a result? For example, the basic Turing test is to have someone talk to a system, not knowing if it's a human or an AI. If it can pass through and be completely unrecognized as anything but human, or the really bad human is recognized as AI, then the AI has basically succeeded. If, however, we look at it as a procedural system, can it understand what it's looking at? Can it then process that and then respond? We now have something very close to a human that understands how the world works and can be part of it, which is the almost threshold to being an AI. There is still a step required beyond that, but beyond everything we've seen so far, that's perhaps the closest we will get. That last hurdle is the one that will perhaps be the biggest question, and that is, can it set its own goals and agendas, rather than doing solely what it was initially programmed to do and grew from? Also from the Neurologica blog, we have the interesting news about an asteroid that will pass by Earth in 2046, most likely around Valentine's Day. The asteroid is roughly 50 meters wide, and this is what makes it interesting. The idea that it might come close to Earth might be giving you concern, but by close, we mean within 1.1 million miles of Earth, or somewhere along the lines of approximately 2 million kilometers of Earth. This, of course, is based purely on it sticking to its current path, but that's rarely what happens, and it's why NASA has put forward the estimate that a 1 in 560 chance that the asteroid will hit Earth on Valentine's Day. Thankfully, there's a relatively low chance. It's an approximate rate of 1/100th of the background rate of things hitting Earth, so we're not going to have to worry just yet. The concern is that given its size and speed, if it does hit Earth, you may need to worry. But there's also the upside to that. Only if it hits somewhere very densely populated. If it hits somewhere relatively unpopulated, or ideally not populated at all, there's almost no danger from it hitting Earth. And this is what distinguishes it from other objects that might land. Land is a perhaps optimistic term, crash. Going to other astrological news, and specifically how Americans continue to refuse to use the metric system in lieu of anything else that they can find. In this case, rather than giving us a consistent and standardized measure, they compare an asteroid to the size of 69 alligators. Yeah, it may be a forgiving measurement, but it's almost meaningless, as this could be anywhere between 235 meters and 320 meters. A very large range, and why the Americans' refusal to use a simple but effective unit of measurement remains baffling. Further astrological news has the James Webb Space Telescope watching as a rare star is just about to go into its supernova. And while just about is a relative term, it's still rare to be able to see this phenomena. That's because it's going to take several hundred years for the star to transform from its current state, which is called the Wolf-Rayet state, into a supernova. And what is special about it, and why it's noteworthy, is that these are rarely seen in the Milky Way. The reason they are so rare and so spectacular to see is that they've basically run out of hydrogen, and therefore they're no longer burning in any sustainable manner. Instead, they now start using up their nitrogen and carbon stores, but as a result, they also lose their mass at a very fast rate. This means that they're no longer producing the same sort of light as they would otherwise. This means that they're, for lack of a better phrase, absorbing radiation while emitting infrared light. The final news we have for you this week is about our star, and specifically how Sol erupted in such a powerful blast that the shockwave hit Earth. and although you may not have noticed it, it was certainly something that those who were monitoring these things did. The process involved a coronal mass ejection, basically the launching of a cloud of solar debris into space in such a way that you would have otherwise been aware of it if you were able to observe it. The speed at which it was launched is 2,127 kilometers, or roughly 1,300 miles, per second. As a general rule, the idea is any coronal mass ejection on the far side of the Sun shouldn't be noticeable. That's because it's on the wrong side of a giant ball of fire that blocks most of its impact. This is the same sort of idea as, say, for example, when something loud is detonated like fireworks on the far side of a building, you may not hear the sound anywhere near as much, and that's because the building blocks the vast majority of what's happening. For the purposes of our Sun, it pretty much is a giant building in the way of a very small firework. This means you probably wouldn't have heard anything. In this case, the sheer size of the eruption is why we know about it. There is a good chance that we're going to see a lot more similar phenomena very soon. That's because the Sun is currently entering its peak of activity, a roughly 11-year cycle, and we're about 2 years from that very high point. Even though we're that far away, there are still currently 100 sunspots which will lead to events like this, and a number of them are congregating in roughly one location. That means there's a good chance we'll see considerably more from this location. There have already been 49 C-class flares, the lowest we need to worry about at the moment, 12 M-class flares, and 1 X-class flare, which is the most powerful that our Sun would generally make. The one that led to this particular video topic is called the R-type, or rare. That's all the news we have for you in this video. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.